My name is Alan Laframboise. I'm here with Juan Carlos Franco, and we're here to talk about app layout and CSS styling with the ArcGIS 4 API, JavaScript API. Like all of my slides, you can find the information and all the links on slides.com/alaframboise. So if you want to follow along with us, or if you want to go to the links afterwards, then everything is available here immediately. So, okay, without further ado, today we want to talk about app design patterns and how to leverage the ArcGIS JavaScript 4 API to achieve a number of different layouts, using the framework, positioning widgets, handling pop-ups in different scenarios, building panels. And the overarching theme that we want to try to transcend and get across is the fact that you can do a lot more with the framework because the framework is so flexible and rich than you could do before with the 3x framework. And you can do a lot more with less CSS. So there was a time when CSS was the way to solve a lot of different problems, especially with respect to layout. But now we can actually control a lot of things programmatically using the API. And I want to show you a number of different patterns and how easy it is. So speaking of patterns, I've put together this repo on my GitHub account. And again, it's linkable from the slides.com slides. And in that repository, it basically has all of the demonstrations that I'm going to show today. So I will just share that with you here. This is what it looks like. There's a number of subchapters in here, and I'm basically just going to be going through each one of these applications individually. So this is great. This is a good kind of design model to follow when you look at different patterns, and I'm hoping that you guys go back and revisit these patterns as you are faced with challenges when you're building your own applications when it comes to layout and so forth. Okay. So let's start with layouts. So the first layout is the most simple. So it's the 100% height and width map, and it's pretty straightforward. As you can see, we've all built this application and maybe seen it many times. So the only thing I really want to point out here is a few CSS things and why we do them. For example, we set the margin to 0. And as you can see, the map is offset just slightly because there are defaults that are built into browsers, and they're all a little bit different. So that margin 0 is really important if you're looking to really flesh up the map against all of the various edges. The other thing that's important is setting the height. So the height is set to 100% here for the view, so it expands the map to 100% of the height of the body and the HTML. Now the width is optional, but we put it as 100% in here just to safeguard the application, just to ensure that the width is expanded to the full size and the area that's available. But most will default to 100%, so it's not always required, not for every browser. So this is the most simple scenario, and we should all be familiar with this. This is called the full page layout. Now, a more common design is what I call the partial page, and this is where we start to integrate and use frameworks like Flex and Grid and different patterns. So let's take a look at this one. So we'll start looking at Grid, and this is the Flex Grid. And in this application here, it's got a couple breakpoints set. So as I change size, I'm going from this desktop size to a mobile size. It's going to change form one time and then a second time. So this is like your smallest mobile view. So how this really works is by setting up a container and setting up all of the flex sizing changes. So I'll just show you this a little bit. If we go down here, we can see we have a wrapper, a header, the map, and then a few asides and a footer. It's kind of stacked that way, and then we have the wrapper set up with the display of flex. We're going to flow with rowing and with using a row and wrap. And then each of the CSS elements will behave accordingly. So that's basically it, except when we hit the media breaks. So we have a 544 and a 780 break here. And what we do is we just change the aside, and then finally, change the aside for the smallest break, and then for 780, we change all of the layout for the map, the left aside, right aside, and the footer. So you can control the order, how you want them to stack, as you can see here, any way that you want. And this is just standard flex. I'm sure we've all used this before, but it's a very common pattern. The other pattern I want to show you is using grid. So grid in CSS is a little bit newer than flex for sure, and a lot of people are excited to use it. A lot of people are using it to replace frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation and other frameworks that are out there. So this is a slightly different design, but same kind of concept. We have a breakpoint from desktop to mobile, where we just move the sidebar up and position the map to the bottom. So in this particular design, it's pretty straightforward as well. Again, we start at the bottom. We have a wrapper class with a few sub div elements, including a couple of boxes, and then the map itself. Now, the nice thing about grid is when you lay out the grid, you actually stack it up by name, so you can stack the header and represent the position in just the string format. So these are template areas, and the template areas are going to change size according to the styles that are defined here. For the wrapper, we're using grid in this particular case as the display type. And then these are the template areas that we have as the header, the sidebar, and the map. So it's a very visual way to lay out your application. So this is how we want the application laid out in its desktop form. But when we hit a breakpoint 544, then we're going to change it to a different stacking order. So that's an example of using CSS Grid. So if you guys are interested in using that framework and that design pattern, then I encourage you to take a look at that application. Moving right along to different frameworks. So Bootstrap 4 is a common dev framework that's out there that folks are using. So let's take a look at some design patterns that we can implement here. So there's a couple things going on here. So I have a whole bunch of different maps. One thing that's nice is the first thing that we can guarantee you is that the CSS classes and the styling will not be affected by Bootstrap. All right, so everything's encapsulated with an Esri dash, and we use our own BEM notification nomenclature within. So there won't be a collision or a problem with the classes, which is really nice. So in here I got some functionality here where I can move multiple maps at the same time. So they're all kind of joined up, which is nice. I can use translations and rotations on the map, and they're still going to respect all the touch events and the panning. So I wanted to show that concept there. Another thing I snuck in here is I restyled the search widget. As you can see, it's just restyled completely, where it's basically transparent on the background and all the way through, and it's sitting in the middle of the page in one of the row structures that's provided by Bootstrap. So that's in there, and it's affecting all my maps. And of course, because this is Bootstrap, it comes out of the box mobile ready. So when we hit a breakpoint, it's going to stack everything accordingly, and you can control the size and when it stacks things. And you can be rest assured that the maps are just going to react and use the space that's available inside of each of the row and columns that are defined in Bootstrap 4. So it works really well. The other thing here that you're noticing is I'm actually panning over these maps. So I'm basically blocking the scroll event. So there's a technique for that. It's documented in the API. It's also in this app. The other thing I'm doing is when you block that scroll event, it actually prevents scrolling of the page. So I have code in here that illustrates how to still scroll the page even though you're not scrolling the map. Okay, I get asked that question quite a few times, so I wanted to integrate that into this sample. Okay, so this is a long page. It's obviously beyond just a full width and height of the screen, and those are some of the tips and tricks for setting that up. Okay. So let's jump into the view and talk about the view a little bit. So when you create a map and the map creates a view, and what happens is there are DOM elements that are added to the page. And the key one obviously is the main div ID that you specify and add, and then we do all kinds of stuff inside. So this is one example of some of the elements that are added. So I want to show you kind of what happens and why this is important to understand and know about. So the first thing we're going to talk about is view padding. And view padding is a concept, and it's an implementation that allows you to space your map out from the borders and the edges of the container that it's living in. So for example, in this case that you're looking at, I actually have view padding top 55, as you can see up here. So that's 55 pixels of view padding that has been programmatically specified. So there's no CSS going on here. And what I'm telling the application to do and the view to do is to move all of the UI elements 55 pixels from the top. And it also changes the center position of the map. All right, so when you zoom in, it's going to maintain the correct 55 offset pixeled center. All right, so there's a lot going on with the view padding that you may have used in the past that you may not have known. So what that looks like in code, if we just go to view padding, I'll show you. You specify it right here when you set the map view, when you create a new map view and you hold on to that variable. Now you can change the view padding at any point in time. This is something a lot of people don't know. You can add and remove view padding depending on when the screen is larger or smaller. And that's a technique that we'll look at in a moment here too. Okay, so that's view padding in a nutshell. Let's take a look at how to integrate the use or the concept of view padding with events. So, and again, this presentation is all about layouts and patterns. So one pattern is we often need to listen to resizing events. And a lot of times we'll go out to the window and grab those events and listen to them. Well, you can listen to the view size event and the view resize event. They're actually properties. So you can watch those properties, and that's what I'm doing here. And if you look in the center at the top, you can see that for every pixel that I move, this is firing. This is a very busy watch handler. So if you have code in here that's doing something, it's going to occur a lot. And it's not what I call throttled. The resizing event or watch handler is a much quieter method. So when you start resizing, it fires, and when you stop resizing, it fires. So it gives you two events to listen to. So if you need to change your UI, why not use that one? So you'll see eventually here at some point, I'm listening for a certain size, and then I hide the title bar in the top because this is my preferred design for a mobile view. You can do whatever you want, but that's just one example. So if we look at the code, this is listening to events, and the only two sections we're going to look at here is basically watching the size event on the view, or the size property that is, and we're going to set the title visible, or we can listen to this resizing event, and then in that case we can also set the title visible, or we can hide it. But again, one is more performant than the other. Right? So just think about what your use case is. If you need to listen for pixel by pixel movement, then it's size. If it's before and after, or during and after, then it's the resizing is a better property to listen for. Okay. The other way that you can listen to things happening on the view and resizing events is to listen to what we call breakpoints. So if you just follow the top right there, right now the width is set to extra large. That's the breakpoint that's defined. And as I change the width size, we'll eventually hit 1200 or less pixels, and then it changes to large, and then less than 1024 is medium, less than 780 is small, and then less than 544 is extra small. Okay? So this is yet another event handling sequence that we can listen to change and respond two different things in our application. So what does this code look like? It's basically just watching the width breakpoint and the height breakpoint. And when we're extra small, we're going to do something, in this case, set the title visible. When we're beyond that, we're going to set the title to visible itself. So that's basically how it works. And the other thing that's interesting is here, I was telling you earlier, you can apply view padding programmatically at any point in time that you want. And this is an example of where we do so. So we set it to 0 and 55, depending on what the breakpoint is. So here's the cool thing about breakpoints. A lot of people don't know this, but you can actually override the default breakpoints. You can say, I don't like the default ones, which are 544, and you can see the rest of them here. And you can override them with a value like 400 as an example. And just so you know, what's happening is, if you look at the view class here, and I'm going to resize again, it's going to turn purple at some point. So there it's flashing purple. So what's happening is the view is adding and removing various classes, okay, to the actual view div when it hits these breakpoints. So that's kind of a cool thing because, number one, we can react to that with CSS, and our pop-up will do that. For example, our pop-up is listening for when the size is between small and extra small, because that's how it knows what size to make the pop-up. So you can listen to those CSS classes being added and removed to the view to respond in a similar way. Okay, so that was a bunch of things about breakpoints and overriding breakpoints, listening to events in the system. So basically, I've showed you basically every way that you can listen to events that are related to resizing. Let's talk about UI containers now. So this is where Franco and I go way back, basically. We battle over these containers, and we came to some common ground finally over time. But what we have to simplify laying out your application is the default UI is what it's called. And it comes with a 15 pixel offset, and it allows you to put your widget elements in different corners. Okay, so that's essentially the default container, if you will. So we'll take a look and see what that looks like. And the perforated line there is just showing you that container that's sitting there. It's empty, it's transparent until you put components inside of it. All right, so you can put components in any corner that you want. And yeah, there's just a little bit of functionality here where I can click on any of these corner containers and hide the elements in there. So of course you can do that. You can hide and show these corner containers as you need, and you can put elements in there, and you can move your UI elements around as your application sizes. And in the last chapter, we looked at how to listen for all the sizing events, so you know how to do that now. So what happens is I'm essentially giving you all these building blocks, and you can look at them and use them as you see fit. Now, there's actually another container. This is the one that I tend to use quite a bit, and it's called the manual container. And as you can see, the perforated line is just around the entire perimeter here. So it's not a set of corner containers, it's just one big container, but it's still affected by padding. So I have 55 pixels of top padding here, and as you can see, it's offset. So that means all of the objects that are in there, all the elements that are in there will be equally offset. So this is super handy as well, and I will show you. So here's an example. So I have the scale bar that's down here in the corner. So what I'm going to do is go to the manual UI, and I'm going to move that scale bar from being positioned in the bottom left to a string called manual. All right, and this is documented as well, but a lot of people overlook this. And when you set it to manual, then you're saying, okay, you're responsible for positioning that element within this larger container. So I'll save that, and I'm going to refresh. And now when I refresh it, you'll see the scale bar is centered in the center. So the only way to get it in the center is to put it in the manual container and then set CSS up to move it accordingly. Okay, so if you don't want to use the corner containers, don't fret. You can always use the manual container and then position whatever you want anywhere within the Vue UI. Is that cool? Okay. Let's see what else. Let's talk about another pattern. Now, in this scenario here, as we talked about default, we talked about manual. This is where you want to position a control on the view that's not affected by padding, and you want absolute control over it. So here's the scenario. This map, I actually want to be bumped 255 pixels over because I have that legend in the corner and I don't want the legend over top of the features. That make sense? All right, so when this thing loads, as you can see, it's bumping the map over, so my true center is in the center of the map over here. And the problem is, because I'm adding view padding, it would actually grab that legend and it would pad it out 250 pixels as well. That's the default behavior of the containers. So if you want to avoid that, you can create your own container. So I call this custom UI container, and I'll show you how to implement it. It's pretty simple. In this case, we're going to create an element, and we're going to give it a custom container class, which is an Esri class, which is cool because you can reuse the CSS classes, right, that we give you. And then we're going to append this to the root, and then we're going to add two widgets to it, the legend and the attribution widget. And that allows the attribution to be stretched out 100%, and it allows this to go in the corner as well. So if you want to see what this looks like internally, we have our root, we have the standard UI, and there's the UI that's being offset by the padding. So I have 250 pixels on the right-hand side of padding, 55 from the top, but I'm not interested in that. I actually want to be able to access the full size of the container. So I have a custom container, and in there I have a legend and the attribution. So that's how you achieve using both view padding and to take advantage of the recentering of the map and full control of positioning your objects in the full available area of the view.
I just want to interrupt here and say that after the next release of the JavaScript API, we'll be working at making Alan happy and make sure that you make it easier to accommodate that layout, because right now it's a little bit tricky because you need to manually place it in a separate container and then position it yourself. But for after 4.11, we'll work at getting that in. So
awesome.
It's easier.
Very cool. Okay, so there's a pattern to get that done for now until 4.11 is released and comes out. Let's talk about widgets now. So Franco and Matt are going to talk about how to build custom widgets, and I'm going to show you the fast and easy way to do it if you don't have time to implement a full widget from the ground up. So I call this a custom button, and I'll show you the design pattern here. So what you can do, like I mentioned earlier, is you can borrow the Esri classes to make your div elements look like Esri elements. So this is just a simple button. It's a div element that I've added some Esri button classes to, and I'm just using it to toggle on and off my legend control. So I'll show you how simple that is. So this is the custom button example. Same deal as before. We basically create a div element, and as you can see, I'm stacking up and I'm adding all of these Esri classes to it so that it looks and behaves like an Esri widget. And then from there, I'm listening to the click event, and I simply toggle the legend on and off. So it's a really fast and easy way. And the other cool thing is I'm able to take advantage of the icons, so I can use any of the calcite icons and embed them in there and so forth. So it's a fast, easy way to create a button, put it into the view. And the last part that I wanted to mention is the corner containers are super awesome. I love them. You can actually pass in just standard DOM elements. So I can do something like view UI add button widget. And this button widget is just really a raw div element. but the corner containers will respect that element the same way as widgets and position them accordingly. So you can put anything in corner elements. They don't have to be just widgets. That's the point here. Okay, so that's cool, I think. Let's talk about implementing a custom control. So, we've got this highlighting and this border on the other controls, as you can see on the legend and so forth. So we can borrow that styling if we want. And in this case here, I'm just showing the location of the cursor, the zoom level, for example, 9, 10, and then the scale level of the current map. This is probably the simplest control on the planet. And the pattern is very similar to what we just looked at. We create a div element. We give the div element some Esri CSS class names, and then we add that raw div element to one of the containers. In this case, I added it to the manual container, but let me show you. I can move that to the bottom left if I want. And then I'm listening to some events, and when I move, I'm going to just populate this little control. So that's basically how that works. So if I refresh my application, I can grab that control, move it to a corner container, and there it is. So that's how simple it is. I'm not going to call this a widget. I call it a control because I don't want to get you guys confused with the session that's coming up in just a moment. Okay. So custom button, that's a custom control. Let's talk about pop-ups for a minute because obviously that's one of the main elements and visual elements that you're going to use. And I guess Franco and I were talking about this, and the amount of engineering effort that went into the pop-up is quite incredible. And the other side of it is that it is a little bit complex at this point. So I'm going to break it down to show you how to control and have absolute control of your pop-ups. So the first thing is to understand the concept of docking. So docking is basically when you have this little icon in the corner and then you dock it somewhere in the view. Now you can see I did something special there, right? What happened to the legend? So there's complexities that follow advanced functionality. So I'm listening for the docked state. So when this pop-up is docked to the top right and it's intercepting the legend, then I hide the legend, and then when it's undocked, I show the legend. So this is a pattern, a technique I use a lot. That way your controls don't overlap. It makes the user more focused on the control that's in their current view. Another way to do this is just to not dock it over top, but you could dock it to the top center, to the top left. So you can dock this basically anywhere you want. So we have these various locations. So those are options. So let me set it back to auto. Now, another thing you can do is control when the pop-up docks. So by default, when you move from a desktop size screen to a mobile size screen, there's going to be docking that occurs. So you can change when that occurs by changing the docking size and value. For example, here's 768. So I'm going to come in here, and when I hit 768, it's actually going to dock a lot sooner than docking at 544. Okay, so you have full control on when you want, if you want the dockable pop-up to dock, or you can avoid it altogether, and you can just say, you know what, you can set it to false, right? And this is documented as well. As you dig into the documentation, you'll see. Now we get in here and we're like saying, no, don't dock. I want you to behave the same way on desktop as mobile, and you're forcing the non-docked scenario. So I'll refer you to my code for this. I'm not going to go through it all now, but I will show you. Just go to this docking sample. And the last thing you can do is you can get really fancy. You can actually write a function, because the position property takes a function value as well. So you can actually have a function that goes out and makes a calculation and says, yes, I want to dock under these scenarios, or no, I don't want to dock. Okay, so you can be even more specific than just using breakpoints. Okay, so my point is you essentially have infinite fidelity and fine-grained control with the docking ability. With that, again, it's just a little bit more complexity, I think, with the design and programming. Okay, let's talk about something else. Pop-ups also have this concept of alignment. So for alignment, what we're talking about is when I click on the map and I click over to the corners as an example, it's going to offset itself and align. So this is easy. You just set a property on the pop-up when it's created or at some point in time, and you can force it, to always be top center if you want, as an example. So you can override that behavior. It's totally up to you. Everybody has different use cases, but I wanted to show you that that is totally possible and within your control. So that's alignment. Here's a technique that I use quite a bit. I like this a lot. If Matt Driscoll is here, or if he was here, he doesn't like this at all, but that's okay. And this is this concept of auto-centering. So to me, when you have a desktop size view, you can offset the pop-up and you can realign it and do things like that. But when you have a mobile view, you're really dealing with a smaller space. So I call this auto center mobile pattern. So basically, whenever the user clicks on a feature, it automatically gets recentered and the pop-up pops up as well. It's a pattern that I really like. I find this very useful when I'm in the field and actually doing field testing, and there's a lot of other mobile apps that behave this way as well. So that code is there if it's of interest to you. If you're building mobile specific applications, I encourage you to look at that one. Sizing. Sizing is interesting. It's a question that I get quite a bit. And when it comes to pop-up sizing, this is where we need to jump into CSS. It's the only concrete way to control the sizing at all different levels. And I'll just give you a sneak peek of what that looks like. So sizing. It's a little bit complicated because, like I mentioned earlier, these classes are being added to the view div, right, as the breakpoints are hit at certain sizes. And what happens is the pop-up main container will respond to that. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, regardless of the breakpoint that's hit, I'm locking it into 450. You see that? So I'm overriding the default behavior. And then for mobile, I'm just locking it into 250 pixels. So the behavior is like this. So there I'm at, I think it's 450. I'm going through breakpoints. I'm still 450. I'm still 450. I'm still 450. And then finally I hit 250 when I hit extra small breakpoint. So a lot of people want this. They don't want their pop-up changing size because we will actually change the size of the pop-up based on the view size and the breakpoints that are added to the view. Okay, and I get it because some people have images that they don't want resized and so forth in there. So that's how you lock in the size of the pop-up. Is that cool? All right, I get that one a lot. Panels. So let's talk about a panel layout in design. So this is probably one of the most simple scenarios. This is a custom button, right, that we already learned how to add to our display. And all I'm doing is I'm adding padding to the map. So I'm actually not moving the div element of the view. It's a very different operation. I'm just adding padding to the map and I'm adding this control to the top right-hand corner and removing the padding. So this is a nice little pattern, a simple div element that's being added. Another one I want to show you that's a little bit more in alignment with the controls that you get out of the box and the widgets that you get out of the box is this concept. I call it responsive expand. All right, so here we're minimizing, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm going to grab this legend widget. I'm going to move it off of the view and I'm going to put it into this expand button. And then now, when I'm in mobile view, it's going to behave like a mobile user would expect it to behave. So there's just a little bit of code there that's grabbing the legend out of the container, putting it in an expand, and then doing the opposite when it gets bigger. It's a great little pattern. I use this all the time, and you can use it for any of the controls. Okay. Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite ones. They're all my favorite ones, but this is even more favorite. So I use this pattern on some of the apps. If you go to ArcGIS for developers and you go to some of the apps that we have in the feature pages there. So I use this pattern because it was all about real estate. So the pop-up obviously behaves like a normal pop-up when I'm touching the features, but I like the pop-up because the pop-up's smart, right? It does all these fancy things, like it makes itself smaller and larger, and it docks itself at the bottom of the view. So what if I want to use that as my panel for my custom content? Why not? So when I click my custom button, what I'm doing is I'm emptying the pop-up and I'm putting one of the controls, one of the widgets into the pop-up. And you're probably wondering, well, why do I want to do that? Well, the pop-up's got all this cool behavior I want to take advantage, like it knows how to resize itself, it knows how to dock itself. It has all of this great UI experience built into it. So this is an example and basically a method that I wanted to show you that you can use. You can reuse the pop-up as a panel. So that's a pop-up panel layout design pattern. And I just threw this one together just before the presentation because I wanted to show you another reincarnation of that. So basically here, this is using the pop-up as essentially a 3D panel. So I'm actually putting the 3D view in there. So wherever I click on my 2D map, it's recreating that view in the pop-up. And so basically I need to block the pop-up default event. And there's a special way to do that, and it's well documented, and it's in this sample as well, because we want to prevent the features from being selected. In this case, we just want the click handler to go off, and we want to replace the content that's in there. So that's kind of cool, right? And again, you're using all of the features and functionality built into that pop-up. It's mobile responsive, it does all that good stuff. Okay. Now we're just going to wrap up with styling, then I'm going to hand it over to Franco here. So we're going to talk about two things with styling. So, I mean, that's how much we can do without styling, right? We've talked about like this much CSS. We only wrote CSS one time, and that was to control the size of the pop-up. So that's pretty cool. In this scenario here, you can actually do a lot of styling just by loading our default styles. So I wanted to show you here, for example, is all I'm doing is I'm changing the CSS reference, right, to the different CSS references that we have hosted on ArcGIS for the ArcGIS JavaScript API. So I can look through all of these different styling options, for example, dark purple, or there's light blue as an example, and I can restyle these without having to write a line of CSS. I'm just swapping the reference out. Okay, so that's an easy way. Again, we still haven't done any overriding in this particular case. The last part is when you want to create your own custom theme. So that's like you're taking matters into your own hands at this point. And in this case, I'm using this orange coloring theme here. And I'm styling all of the widgets except for the search widget up here in the corner. Okay, so that's an important note to make, and I'm even styling the pop-up with this orange color. So when you do manual override styling of CSS, you have to consider a few things. For example, hover events. You have to provide styling for that. So my hover color is different. You have to handle the background and the foreground color as well. So I'll give you a sneak peek of what this looks like. This is a custom theme. So here you can see the theme is prefaced with the theme class in this case, and then an Esri widget is overridden, the button, the menu, some of these containers. So this is kind of the minimum set of classes to override in order to achieve new background color and foreground color. The part I wanted to show you is if I go down a little bit further, is I left out the search, and the reason I did that is because the search is up here in the corner, and I didn't want to color code that the same way as everything else. So I override a few elements of the search here and the search button. But that's really it. It's really not too bad. It's just a little bit of override CSS here. And the other thing to make note is the common practice is to put the theme class on the body or on the actual view itself. So that's doing some custom CSS styling. And with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Juan Franco, and he's going to talk to us about some more styling possibilities with Sass.
Cool. Thank you, Alan. So, as Alan mentioned, it is possible for you to use CSS and override parts of the theme based on what you need in your application and your theme. But there's going to be a point where that's going to be too brittle. For example, if we introduce a new widget, it's very likely that you won't have those classes already ready for the update of the API. And that means when you move to a different version, you might need to find out which are the new classes and how to override them. And then if another release comes by, it might break your styles. So there must be an easy way, and luckily there is, in terms of the JavaScript API, because internally, and we use Sass to build all of our themes, and we do that because it helps us kind of keep all the repetition of CSS within different modules that we can reuse across the theming system, and that really makes it easier for updates. So in one file, for example, we keep all the references to all the color variables, and just by changing a few or introducing new ones, the entire widget theme gets updated and everything stays consistent. So I'm going to be talking about how you can use Sass to theme in this context, but before that, I want to talk a little bit about how the CSS is structured inside of the JavaScript API. So I'm going to go first into this repo here, this is where the JavaScript, you can access the minified version of the API. And inside of this, you can take a look. Alan showed you before, but here are all the themes that come out of the box inside the JavaScript API. So we provide 10 different themes out of the box, and all of these are produced by the same structure of Sass files, and we just have a small configuration per theme that allows you to create an entirely different colored theme.
Can we see one?
Huh?
Can we see one?
Yes, we'll see one in a few. And also we have a styling reference page in the guide in the SDK of the JavaScript API that gives you a little bit more hints at the different view size classes that Alan talked about, the themes. If you're planning on using Sass as a solution, and as well as an example of the theming override. So with that said, I am now going to move to, I talked about this and not being a flexible solution. So when it comes to Sass, in my repo, I've hosted a utility to kind of make it easier to work with theming. So the idea is, this is just a repo. If you go to Alan's slides, you'll get access to the link. But the steps to get this working is you basically would end up cloning the repo and then doing npm install on wherever it's cloned. And then the tool will automatically set up the structure and then make it easier for you to start overriding, and I'll show an example of that. And once you make your changes, it's going to compile, place it in a directory that you can just move to a web server, and as long as your application is referencing it, it's going to bring in the theme. So I've gone ahead and, is that readable in the back? A little bit? Sort of? Okay. So I've gone ahead and cloned the repo ahead of time, and after this, all you would need to do is do an npm install, and it's going to bring in the minified JavaScript API that I showed you earlier, and then it's going to place it in a structure that's a little bit more manageable for you to customize, and then it's going to launch a preview page to kind of, so you can keep track of the changes that you're making. So I want to show what this, once you install this utility, what you end up with is, this is a preview page that we're seeing right now. you get it by default. And it's just a simple page that brings in a few widgets so you can see what the pop-up looks like, what the search widget looks like. And you can also customize this preview page if you need to worry about a different widget. And it'll also set up a Sass folder. And inside of this, you get examples of the themes that I mentioned before that we use internally to create the different themes, with a set of colors that we customize per theme. So for example, if you wanted to introduce a different theme, just by tweaking these few variables, you would get a different looking theme, and that is consistent across the entire widgets. If you wanted to learn more about how the actual structure of the entire widget styling is, you can go into the base directory and take a look at the different Sass files that we have per widgets and the core ones. For example, I mentioned the core color ones are in the color Sass file. We have ones for type, sizes, and layout as well. We have different ones so you can browse if you need to. So right now in the preview page we have the default out of the box white theme, right? So just as a quick example, if I bring in the dark green options into another directory that gets created by this utility, under my theme you get a main Sass file, and as soon as you start customizing this, the utility is going to watch for any changes on this file, and then it's going to compile and relaunch the preview page. So you can see in the background the preview page updated automatically without me having to do anything. And this will happen as you make changes. So kind of make it easier for you to kind of see what the overall ending theme is going to look like. So it's pretty useful. And
this is a lot less CSS styling than what I had to do to create a custom theme. You
Correct.
saw I had probably 100 lines of CSS overrides. This is just maybe 15 lines of Sass override variables that affect everything equally. So it's a very, very fast and effective way to provide styling and theming.
Correct. And I mean, as I said before, as you override these variables, the whole theme are referencing the same values. So you're pretty much guaranteed that all the widgets are going to honor the variables that you are defining. And what you could also do is, for example, taking Alan's example of the custom styling app that he started with. I mentioned how the preview page is set up for you, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't, there's no reason why you can't change it to look or actually be your own custom application, right? So for example, here I brought in Alan's custom theme example, and I'll just remove the custom CSS that he introduced and just add a reference to, actually I didn't call this out, but when you're making changes, the tool is going to compile the theme for you, and it's going to place it in this dist folder. So all you need to do in terms of your application is refer to the dist folder instead of the JavaScript default main style sheet.
So yeah, so you're responsible now for hosting the CSS, right? Because you're recompiling it, just like if you recompiled the JavaScript API, which you know is possible as well, which would mean you'd have to host it. So
for example, now that I made these changes, it's using Alan's application, and it's already set up to reload the styles if I make any further changes. And I've gone ahead and cheated and already had a kind of a set of starter classes that we can bring in. So to kind of start trying to follow the design that Alan wanted. So for example, here I have a set of custom colors that I want the application to use. I can also provide different fonts. It's not picking them up. I have an issue with my styles. But you get the idea. As soon as you are overriding the variables, the theme recompiles and it's picking them up. And if I'm just going to uncomment all this so you can see a little bit, it should look a little bit closer to the original application. So it's a good base to get you started at easily customizing the look and feel of your applications. And the good thing is, since it's using Sass, if you have common colors, for example, you can just define a variable and reference it throughout the theme. So there you go. That's one approach for flexible styling.
Okay, cool. So all kinds of options. And I think, again, one of the messages that we wanted to transcend was you can do a lot with your UI design and layout just by programmatically adding components and removing and moving components around your view. We talked about the different containers. We talked about putting custom elements in the different containers as well. We talked about how to get full control of the pop-up, when and where it breaks and docks. We talked about breakpoints, how you could override them. If you want one breakpoint, you can implement it that way. If you want the 5 breakpoints that we implement, then you can use them as well. So there's a lot of design work that has gone into the API to help you lay out and build better designs. Especially when it comes to building both desktop and mobile designs. There's a lot of friendly things in there. And it's easy to build on these little tips and tricks that I've added, like, for example, auto recentering the pop-up for mobile. It was really 5 lines of code to do that because I had all of the event handlers and listeners in place. It was really super easy. So that's the message for today. Try to do more with less CSS. And maybe more Sass, if you're interested in going down that road. And again, the slides are on slides.com, et la framboise. And of course, don't forget to take the survey. If you guys enjoyed this, we'll do something like it again next year. And yeah, we have some time for any questions, if there are any questions. One over here. Yes. So the question is, are the calcite icons available? And absolutely. So if you go to the SDK in the styling section, we actually have a reference in there that shows all of the SVG icons that can be acquired and used very normally in the application, just like I did in my custom buttons. So it's a great question, and absolutely they're there for use. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? All right, guys. Have a great conference and hope to see you tonight.